The wind howling through Ophir's End sounded like a death rattle. 3 of the most feared bounty hunters in the Nevada territory stood in the muddy street, hands hovering over iron that had already sent 50 men to early graves. They were hunting a ghost, a man with no name, no past, and no mercy. But when the dust settled, the stranger didn't cower. He just struck a match, stared down 3 drawn guns, and whispered, "I don't see 3 gunslingers. I see 3 dead men." Stick around, because the true story of how this nameless drifter dismantled a legendary crew in 1874 is packed with blood, betrayal, and a twist you won't see coming. The Nevada territory in October of 1874 was an unforgiving expanse of cracked earth, sagebrush, and broken promises. Ophir's End was the capital of all 3. It was a dying silver camp, a cluster of weathered clapboard buildings clinging to the side of a rusted mountain, populated by men who had long ago given up on salvation. On a Tuesday afternoon, the local paralysis was broken by the arrival of 3 riders. They did not ride in like men looking for a hot bath or a cold drink. They rode in like a plague. At the front rode Gideon Reed. Formerly a lead detective for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Reed had been dismissed in 1871 for methods deemed excessively cruel even by frontier standards. He was a tall, skeletal man dressed in an immaculately tailored dark suit that seemed utterly impervious to the desert dust. Across his saddle rested a customized 1873 Winchester repeating rifle. Reed was the architect of violence, a man who calculated bullet trajectories and human desperation with the same cold, dead eyes. To his right was Elias Cole. If Reed was the brain, Cole was the ego. Hailing from the bloody borderlands of Texas, Cole wore twin ivory-handled Colt Navy revolvers low on his hips and a massive Bowie knife sheathed against his thigh. He was notorious for a fast draw and a temper like a kerosene fire. He had a bounty on his own head in 3 states, but he operated freely because no sheriff was foolish enough to try and collect it. Bringing up the rear was Josiah Higgins. He was less a man and more a force of blunt force trauma. Broad-shouldered, scarred from smallpox and knife fights, Higgins wore a thick buffalo hide coat despite the blistering heat. He carried a sawn-off double-barrel shotgun that he affectionately referred to as the Widowmaker. Higgins was the muscle, a tracker who operated on pure, unhinged instinct. They hitched their horses outside Amos G. Finch's saloon. The boardwalk groaned under Higgins's heavy boots. Inside, the tinny sound of a piano died instantly as the swinging doors parted. The afternoon patrons, miners, drunks, and drifters, froze. Sheriff William T. Cobb, a man whose badge was mostly decorative at this point in his life, was sitting in the corner nursing a warm beer. He swallowed hard as Gideon Reed approached his table. "Sheriff Cobb," Reed said, his voice a quiet, rasping whisper that cut through the silence of the room. He didn't ask. He stated the name as a fact. "That's right," Cobb replied, instinctively resting a hand near his holster, though he knew he wouldn't draw. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "We are looking for a man," Reed said, pulling a folded telegraph paper from his breast pocket. "Rides a roan gelding, wears a canvas duster, carries a Colt single-action army, 7.5-inch barrel. No known name." Cobb wiped sweat from his brow. "Lots of drifters pass through Ophir's End, mister." Elias Cole stepped forward, a smug grin splitting his face. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on Cobb's table. "This ain't just a drifter, lawman. This man robbed the private rail car of Mr. Arthur Pendleton outside of Carson City 3 days ago. Left 4 armed guards bleeding out in the dirt." The name Arthur Pendleton made the air in the saloon grow colder. Pendleton was a cattle baron who owned half the politicians in Nevada. If Pendleton sent his personal hounds, it meant whatever the stranger stole was worth more than gold. "Pendleton's gold ain't my jurisdiction," Cobb muttered. He didn't take gold, Reed corrected smoothly. He took a leather-bound ledger, a private account book, and we are here to retrieve it. Josiah Higgins let out a low, guttural laugh from the doorway. He grabbed a passing patron, a young, terrified miner, by the collar and shoved him brutally against the bar. "You seen him, boy?" Higgins growled. "No, I swear to God," the miner cried. Higgins sneered and tossed the boy to the floor like a rag doll. "We wait," Reed commanded, waving Higgins off. "He is running out of water, and the only pass through the mountains is blocked by a rock slide. He has to come here. Amos," Reed called to the terrified saloon owner, "bring us a bottle of your finest rye, and leave the glasses. We'll be here a while." For 3 agonizing hours, the town of Ophir's End held its breath. The hunters sat at the center table, a terrifying trinity of death, controlling the room through sheer presence. Cole continuously spun the cylinder of his Colt. Higgins drank directly from a whiskey jug, his eyes darting toward the street. Reed simply sat perfectly still, his pocket watch ticking loudly in the quiet room. Then, at precisely 4 o'clock, the wind kicked up, rattling the saloon windows. Footsteps sounded on the boardwalk, slow, deliberate. The jingle of spurs echoed like chimes. The swinging doors opened, casting a long, dark shadow across the sawdust-covered floor. The man standing in the doorway was coated in white desert dust. His canvas duster was frayed at the edges. A battered Stetson was pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a legendary train robber. He looked exhausted, half-starved, and entirely unremarkable, except for the way he carried himself. There was an absolute stillness to him. He didn't glance at the 3 deadliest men in the territory sitting in the center of the room. He walked straight to the bar, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Amos Finch, trembling violently, approached the bar. "Whiskey," the nameless man said. His voice was gravel, dry and flat. "Leave the bottle." At the center table, Gideon Reed snapped his pocket watch shut. The click echoed like a gunshot. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The silence in Amos Finch's saloon was absolute, save for the glug of amber liquid pouring into a dirty shot glass. The nameless man raised the glass, knocked it back, and exhaled slowly. He didn't turn around. Behind him, chairs scraped against the floorboards. Elias Cole was the first to move, stepping out from the table, his hand resting casually on the ivory grip of his right-side Colt. "Well, I'll be damned," Cole drawled, his Texas accent thick and mocking. "Arthur Pendleton told us we were hunting a phantom, a regular demon of the high desert. You just look like a piece of sun-dried jerky to me." Josiah Higgins chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. He racked both hammers of his sawn-off shotgun. Click-clack. The sound caused 2 patrons by the back wall to scramble out the rear window, preferring their chances in the alley dirt. Gideon Reed stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from his suit jacket. He took 2 measured steps forward. "Let us make this simple, sir," Reed said, his voice carrying the authority of a judge handing down a death sentence. "You have something belonging to Mr. Arthur Pendleton, a ledger. Hand it over, and perhaps we can discuss a peaceful resolution." The nameless man poured a second glass of whiskey. He picked it up, turned slowly, and leaned his back against the mahogany bar. He looked at Higgins, then at Cole, and finally let his gaze settle on Reed. His eyes were pale, devoid of fear, devoid of anything resembling human anxiety. "Pendleton," the nameless man finally spoke, his tone conversational. "Pendleton's a liar." Cole's smile vanished. "Watch your mouth, drifter." "He told you I robbed his train," the stranger continued, ignoring Cole entirely. He took a sip of his drink. "He told you I shot his guards, but he didn't tell you what was in the ledger, did he, Reed?" Reed's expression remained a mask of stone, but his eyes narrowed fractionally. "The contents of the ledger are of no concern to us. We are paid for its retrieval." "He paid you $10,000, the nameless man said. Cole and Higgins exchanged a sharp, confused look. Pendleton had offered them $5,000. Total. 10,000, the stranger repeated, seeing the shift in their body language. He reached into his duster. Instantly, 3 guns leveled at his chest. The stranger moved agonizingly slow, pulling out not a gun but a cigar. He struck a match against the bar top, lit the tip, and puffed a cloud of blue smoke into the stifling air. The ledger contains the names of every judge, every sheriff, and every politician Pendleton bribed to steal the water rights in the valley, the stranger said, holding the cigar between 2 fingers. But it also contains the receipts for the massacres, the homesteaders he had burned out, the families he had buried. "Shut up," Higgins snarled, raising the shotgun. "I don't care about no homesteaders. Hand over the book." "You should care, Josiah," the stranger said calmly. "Because Pendleton didn't send 3 men to bring back a book that could hang him. He sent 1 man he trusts to bring back the book, and he paid that man extra to make sure the other 2 didn't survive to blackmail him later." The psychological knife slipped in seamlessly. Cole's hand twitched over his revolver. He took a half step away from Reed. "What the hell is he talking about, Gideon?" "It is a lie, Elias. A desperate bluff from a cornered animal," Reed said smoothly, but there was a sudden tension in his shoulders. He didn't look at Cole. He kept his eyes locked on the stranger. "Shoot him." "If it's a bluff," the nameless man said, dropping his cigar to the floor and crushing it under his boot, "why is Reed's right hand closer to his hideout gun than his rifle?" Cole instinctively glanced at Reed's hand, which was indeed hovering near the lapel of his suit, nowhere near the Winchester slung over his shoulder. It was only a fraction of a second, a momentary lapse in focus, but for a man with no name and nothing to lose, a fraction of a second was a lifetime. Cole looked back, his face twisting in rage. "You son of a—" The stranger didn't draw from the hip. In a blur of motion that defied the exhaustion he had displayed moments before, his right hand swept down, drew the heavy Colt Peacemaker, and fired in one fluid, blindingly fast arc. He didn't aim for the chest. He didn't aim for the head. Bang! The heavy .45 caliber slug shattered the oil lantern hanging directly above the center table. Flaming kerosene exploded downward in a shower of liquid fire, splashing across Josiah Higgins's thick buffalo coat. Higgins shrieked as his left arm and chest erupted in flames. He blindly pulled the triggers of the Widowmaker. The twin blasts of buckshot tore a massive hole in the ceiling, bringing down a shower of plaster and dust. Bang! The stranger's second shot took Elias Cole in the right shoulder just as the Texan cleared leather. Cole spun, crying out as his ivory-handled revolver clattered to the floorboards. He scrambled backward, clutching his shattered shoulder, firing wildly with his left hand. Bullets chewed the mahogany bar into splinters. The air instantly filled with the acrid, choking stench of black powder smoke and burning hair. Gideon Reed, true to his cold nature, didn't flinch at the fire or the screams. He dropped to one knee, sweeping the Winchester off his back, levering around into the chamber and firing blindly into the thick smoke where the stranger had been standing. But the stranger wasn't there. As soon as he took his second shot, the nameless man had thrown himself behind the heavy oak of the bar counter. He crawled rapidly through the broken glass and spilled whiskey, moving toward the saloon's back hallway. "Lock the doors!" Reed barked over the chaos, coughing through the thick smoke. He stood up, tracking his rifle barrel across the shattered room. "He's still in here! Higgins, put yourself out, you fool!" Higgins was rolling on the floor, crushing the flames against the sawdust, roaring in agony and fury. Cole was leaning against a support pillar, leaving a smear of blood on the wood, his eyes wide with shock. The 3 deadliest hunters in the West had completely lost control in the span of 3 seconds. From the darkened shadows of the back hallway, a voice drifted out, calm, cold, and echoing through the smoke. "I told you," the nameless man's voice said. "I don't see 3 gunslingers. I see 3 dead men." A heavy door slammed shut in the back of the saloon, followed by the sound of a heavy wooden beam dropping into place. The stranger had barred himself inside the saloon's boarding rooms. He wasn't running out the back. He had barricaded them in together. Reed slowly lowered his rifle, the horrifying realization dawning on him. They hadn't trapped the rat in a cage. They had just locked themselves in a cage with a wolf. The silence that followed the slamming of the heavy wooden beam was heavier than the black powder smoke choking the saloon. In the center of the devastated room, the smell of roasted wool, blistered flesh, and spilled rye whiskey mingled into a nauseating perfume. Josiah Higgins was on his knees, his massive chest heaving. The fire was out, smothered by the sawdust and the blood-soaked dirt of the floorboards, but the left side of his buffalo coat was a charred, smoking ruin. The skin beneath it was angry, red, and weeping. He let out a low, vibrating growl that sounded more animal than human, his thick fingers gripping the stock of his dropped widowmaker so hard his knuckles turned bone white. Against the far wall, Elias Cole was doing a poor job of hiding his panic. He had slid down the support pillar, clutching his shattered right shoulder. Blood pulsed in an alarming steady rhythm through his fingers, staining his pristine white shirt a brilliant crimson. His ivory-handled Colt lay abandoned in the debris, useless to a man whose dominant arm was currently a ruined mass of torn muscle and chipped bone. Gideon Reed, however, stood perfectly still. He did not rush to aid his men. He did not curse the nameless man. Instead, he meticulously analyzed the geometry of the room, the thickness of the walls, and the structural integrity of the heavy oak door separating them from the back hallway. "Amos," Reed said. His voice was a calm, chilling rasp that cut through Higgins's groans. "Where does that hallway lead?" Amos Finch, the saloon owner, was cowering behind the shattered remains of his mahogany bar, a bottle of gin clutched to his chest like a holy relic. He peeked over the splintered wood, his eyes wide with stark terror. "It leads to the boarding rooms, Mr. Reed. 6 rooms, 3 on each side. A back stairwell leads up to the balcony, but the door at the end of the hall, it's reinforced, iron hinges, drop bar. We use it to lock up the liquor shipments." "Are there windows?" Reed asked, his eyes never leaving the oak door. "Small ones. Too small for a man to fit through," Amos stammered. He barred the door from the inside. "He ain't running. He's waiting." Reed slowly raised his Winchester, resting the barrel on his left forearm. Fascinating. He has trapped himself in a bottleneck, a fatal tactical error for a man fighting 3-1. 2-1, you cold-blooded bastard, Cole spat, his breath ragged. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the pillar. "I can't shoot, and Higgins is half-cooked. And what the hell was he talking about, Gideon? Pendleton paying you $10,000? Paying you to make sure we didn't ride back?" Reed finally turned his head to look at Cole. His eyes were like chips of black flint. "Elias, do not let the desperate lies of a dying man infect your mind. We are professionals. We have a job. The bounty is 5,000, as agreed." "He knew you went for your hideout gun, Gideon. I saw it." Cole's voice rose to a hysterical pitch, the shock of the gunshot wound fraying his nerves. "You were going to let him shoot me." "If I wanted you dead, Elias, I would not require a nameless drifter to do the labor," Reed stated matter-of-factly. He turned his attention back to the hulking brute on the floor. "Higgins, can you fight?" Higgins slowly rose to his feet. His face was a mask of soot and fury. He didn't speak. He simply snapped the double barrel of his shotgun open, ejected the 2 spent shells, and shoved 2 fresh paper cartridges into the breech. He snapped it shut with a violent flick of his wrists. The message was clear. "Good," Reed said. "He is in a narrow hallway. A shotgun is the optimal tool for such an environment. Break down the door, Josiah. I will cover you from the flank. Elias, watch the front windows in case he miraculously finds a way onto the roof and circles back." Cole sneered, drawing his secondary revolver, a smaller Smith & Wesson, with his trembling left hand. "I ain't taking orders from you anymore, Reed. I'm watching my own back." Reed ignored the insubordination. The hunt was the only thing that mattered now. He nodded to Higgins. Higgins marched toward the heavy oak door like a wounded grizzly bear. He didn't bother trying the handle. He turned his broad shoulder, took 3 thunderous steps, and slammed his entire 300-pound frame against the wood. The door groaned, the iron hinges shrieking in protest, but the heavy beam on the other side held. Higgins backed up, roared, and hit it again. A hairline fracture appeared down the center of the oak. Again, Reed commanded, sighting down the barrel of his Winchester, aiming precisely at chest height through the splintering wood. Higgins hit the door a third time with earth-shattering force. The wooden drop bar on the opposite side snapped with a crack like a dry branch. The door burst inward, tearing off its bottom hinge and slamming against the hallway wall. Higgins immediately leveled the Widowmaker into the darkness of the hall, his finger tightening on the trigger. But there was no target. The hallway was completely dark. The Nameless Man had shot out the single oil lamp that usually illuminated the corridor. The doors to all 6 boarding rooms hung wide open, creating a labyrinth of shadows and dead ends. It was completely silent, save for the dripping of something wet onto the floorboards. "Come out, you coward!" Higgins bellowed, the sound echoing down the narrow passage. "I'm going to peel the skin off your skull." "Patience, Josiah," Reed whispered, stepping lightly to the edge of the doorway, using the frame for cover. "He wants you to charge in blind. The man is a predator. Treat him as such." But Higgins was beyond reason, beyond tactics. The pain from his burns was a blinding white light in his mind, demanding violence. He stepped over the broken door and crossed the threshold into the dark hallway, his heavy boots crunching on the shattered glass of the lamp. "Higgins, hold your position!" Reed snapped, a rare edge of genuine alarm piercing his calm facade. It was too late. The moment Josiah Higgins's right boot crossed the threshold of the second boarding room, the darkness exploded. The Nameless Man hadn't hidden at the end of the hall. He had positioned himself directly behind the door of the very first room on the right, waiting with terrifying, calculating patience for the heavy tracker to walk past him. As Higgins moved toward the second room, the Nameless Man stepped silently out of the first. He didn't use the heavy Colt Peacemaker. In the tight, chaotic confines of the hallway, a long-barreled revolver was too slow, too unwieldy. Instead, the glint of a 10-inch Arkansas toothpick knife flashed in the dim light. Before Higgins could even register the movement behind him, the Nameless Man drove the heavy blade upward, plunging it deep into the thick, unburned muscle of Higgins's right thigh, twisting it violently before ripping it out. Higgins let out a deafening roar of agony, his leg buckling instantly. As he collapsed, his finger reflexively jerked the trigger of the Widowmaker. A massive blast of buckshot tore into the empty wall at the far end of the hall, filling the enclosed space with a blinding flash and deafening thunder. Reed, firing by instinct at the muzzle flash, pumped 3 rounds from his Winchester into the hallway. Crack! 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 The bullets splintered the door frames, but the Nameless Man had already dropped low, sliding beneath the trajectory of Reed's fire. In the chaotic strobing light of the gunshots, Reed caught a fleeting glimpse of the ghost. The Nameless Man grabbed the barrel of Higgins's shotgun as the massive tracker fell. With a brutal, twisting wrench, he tore the weapon from Higgins's grasp. "Gideon!" Cole screamed from the main room, his paranoia peaking. "What's happening? Shoot him! Shoot him!" "Silence!" Reed barked, leveraging another round into the chamber. In the dark hallway, Higgins was thrashing on the floor, bleeding heavily from the femoral artery. He reached out with his massive, meaty hands, trying to grapple the stranger in the dark. But the Nameless Man was a phantom. He stepped back, calmly reversed his grip on the stolen Widowmaker, and brought the heavy, brass-bound wooden stock crashing down onto the back of Higgins's skull. There was a sickening crunch. Higgins's massive body went entirely limp, collapsing face first into the dusty floorboards. The toughest tracker in the Nevada territory, a man who had survived Indian raids, bar brawls, and a dozen shootouts, was neutralized in less than 10 seconds without the stranger firing a single shot. The Nameless Man tossed the empty shotgun onto Higgins's back. He didn't retreat. He stood in the pitch-black hallway, his breathing steady, entirely invisible to the 2 men waiting in the saloon. "One down, The calm, gravelly voice drifted out from the darkness. It didn't sound out of breath. It sounded like he was simply taking inventory. Your muscle is dead, Reed. It's just you, the bleeder, and me. In the main room, Elias Cole backed away from the hallway entrance, his boots slipping slightly in the spilled whiskey. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat. He looked at Reed, who was still aiming the Winchester at the empty doorway. "He killed Josiah," Cole whispered, his voice trembling. "He killed him in the dark with a damn knife." "He is attempting to terrify you, Elias," Reed said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, chilling calm. "Do not let him. He's still trapped. He has a revolver and a knife. We have range, and we have the light." "Light?" Cole spat, gesturing wildly with his good hand to the dim, smoky saloon. "I can't see a damn thing. He's picking us apart. He was right. You set us up." Reed finally lowered the rifle, turning slowly to face the hysterical Texan. The coldness in Reed's eyes was absolute. "Elias, if you do not calm yourself, you are going to get us both killed. Now, move to the left side of the door. If he steps out, you fire." But Cole was unraveling. The pain, the blood loss, and the terrifying efficiency of the nameless man had completely broken his nerve. He looked at the shattered front windows of the saloon. Freedom. He could leave Reed here. He could survive. "No," Cole gasped, shaking his head. "No, I'm done. You want the ledger, Gideon? You go in the dark and get it yourself. I'm riding out." Cole turned his back on the hallway, limping heavily toward the swinging doors at the front of the saloon. Elias," Reed said softly. Cole didn't stop. "Go to hell, Reed." Gideon Reed sighed, a small, barely perceptible sound of disappointment. He raised the Winchester, smoothly tracked the barrel, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The bullet struck Elias Cole squarely between the shoulder blades. The Texan's back arched violently, a spray of red painting the swinging saloon doors before he collapsed face first onto the boardwalk outside, dead before his face hit the wood. Amos Finch let out a strangled sob from behind the bar, pressing his hands over his ears. Reed slowly levered the rifle, ejecting the smoking brass casing. It clinked musically against the floor. He didn't look at Cole's body. He turned back to the dark hallway. "Two down!" Reed called out to the darkness, a cruel, thin smile finally touching his lips. "It appears your psychological trick worked, my friend." He panicked. But as you said, Pendleton prefers fewer men to share the secret with. I suppose I owe you a word of thanks. From the shadows of the hallway, the nameless man stepped into the faint light of the doorway. The blade of his knife was wet, catching the dim glow of the remaining saloon lanterns. He looked at the body of Cole, bleeding out on the boardwalk, then back at Reed. "You don't owe me anything, Reed," the nameless man said, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. "But you owe the devil a soul, and I'm here to collect." Gideon Reed did not blink. The dead body of his partner, Elias Cole, lay bleeding out onto the dusty boardwalk behind him. But Reed's attention was entirely consumed by the blood-soaked phantom standing at the edge of the hallway. The arithmetic of the situation had fundamentally shifted, and Reed, above all things, was a mathematician of violence. The odds were now 1-to-1. The bounty was solely his, and there were no more unpredictable variables like a hot-headed Texan or a heavy-handed brute to ruin his line of sight. A soul," Reed repeated, his voice smooth and untroubled, echoing over the crackle of the dying flames from the first lantern. He took a slow, deliberate step to his right, keeping the heavy mahogany bar between himself and the hallway entrance. "I'm afraid my soul was surrendered a long time ago, my friend, back in the slaughterhouses of Chicago, long before I ever pinned a Pinkerton badge to my chest. You cannot threaten a man with damnation when he already considers himself a resident of hell." The nameless man remained partially obscured by the thick shadows of the corridor. The dim light caught the edge of his jaw and the polished steel of the heavy Colt Peacemaker hanging at his side. He didn't rise to the bait. "Pendleton didn't hire you for your soul, Reed. He hired you because you're a machine, but machines break when you introduce sand into the gears." "And you are the sand?" Reed asked, a cruel, thin smile playing on his lips. He raised the Winchester, the barrel tracking smoothly. "You flatter yourself. You're merely an obstacle, a dead man who has not yet realized his lungs have stopped taking in air." "If I'm dead," the stranger's gravelly voice drifted out, calm and utterly devoid of panic, "then why are you sweating, Gideon?" Reed's eyes narrowed fractionally. It was true. Despite his tailored suit and icy demeanor, a single drop of perspiration had carved a clean line through the soot on his temple. The heat in the saloon was rising, the air turning thick and unbreathable as the spilled kerosene continued to smolder in the floorboards. "I am simply calculating," Reed replied, cocking the lever of the Winchester with a sharp metallic clack. "You have a Colt revolver, a formidable weapon at 10 paces, but we are at 30 paces. You are standing in a fatal bottleneck. If you step out, I will put a .44 caliber bullet through your heart before you can raise your arm. If you stay in the hallway, you will eventually asphyxiate from the smoke. You have no move left." "I have the ledger," the nameless man countered. "The one with Judge Emmett Tolliver's signature on the water rights theft. The one detailing the massacre at Black Rock. You shoot me in the heart, my blood ruins the pages. You burn me out, the fire takes the book. Pendleton doesn't pay for ash, Reed." Reed paused. The logic was sound. If the ledger was destroyed, the $10,000 evaporated with it. He needed the man dead, but he needed the book intact. From beneath the shattered bar, Amos Finch let out a pathetic, whimpering cough. The smoke was banking down from the ceiling, a thick, toxic fog of burning wood and black powder. "Amos," Reed said, his eyes never leaving the doorway, "crawl out the back window. Go tell Sheriff Cobb that the situation is being handled. If he interferes, I will kill him. Go." The saloon owner didn't need to be told twice. With a scramble of desperate, scrabbling limbs, Amos threw himself through the shattered glass of the rear window, tumbling into the alleyway and leaving the two men entirely alone in the dying saloon. "It seems we have privacy," Reed said softly. He reached into his coat pocket with his left hand, extracting a silver lighter. He snapped it open, a bright flame flaring in his palm. "You are correct about one thing, stranger. I cannot burn the ledger. But I do not need to burn the ledger to burn you." Reed didn't throw the lighter. Instead, he raised the Winchester and fired a single deafening shot directly into the second large oil lamp hanging over the piano in the corner. The glass shattered in a rain of jagged shards. A gallon of highly flammable whale oil cascaded over the upright piano and the wooden floorboards. The latent heat and sparks from the room instantly ignited the fuel. A wall of bright, searing orange flame roared to life, casting wild, dancing shadows across the saloon. The fire illuminated the hallway perfectly. The shadows were stripped away in a violent wash of light, but the nameless man was already gone. In the fraction of a second it took Reed to turn his rifle toward the lamp, the stranger had faded backward into the boarding house labyrinth. "Clever," Reed whispered, the heat of the burning piano washing over his face. "But a cage is still a cage, even when it is illuminated." He began to move. Gideon Reed did not rush. He stalked forward with the terrifying, methodical grace of a praying mantis. The fire was spreading rapidly now, catching the cheap velvet curtains and the dry wallpaper. The roar of the flames began to drown out the silence, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction. This was exactly what Reed wanted. The noise would cover his footsteps. The shifting light would confuse his prey. He stepped over Higgins's massive, unconscious form at the threshold of the hallway, his boots making no sound on the wood. The hunt had entered its final, most intimate phase. The boarding house hallway was a tunnel of suffocating heat and blinding, swirling smoke. The fire from the main saloon was acting like a furnace, pushing a thick, choking cloud of gray ash down the narrow corridor. The nameless man crouched low in the third room on the left, pressing a damp bandana to his nose and mouth. He had poured the water pitcher from the bedside table over his face, soaking his duster to ward off the encroaching heat. He breathed shallowly, his eyes stinging. He could hear the fire consuming the saloon behind him, the crackle of dry timber giving way to the deep roaring bass of structural beams catching light. But beneath that roar, he listened for something else. The whisper of a leather sole on a floorboard, the metallic click of a rifle hammer. Gideon Reed was coming. The nameless man looked around the small, cramped boarding room. It contained a narrow iron bed, a cheap pine dresser, and a washstand. A single small window looked out onto the muddy side street. He knew Reed's tactical mind. Reed would expect him to either break the window to escape, making himself an easy target in the narrow alley, or wait in ambush behind the door. The stranger decided to do neither. He moved quickly, silently lifting the heavy iron bed frame. With a grunt of exertion, he tipped it onto its side, dragging it directly in front of the thin wooden wall that separated his room from the adjacent one. He then took his damp canvas duster, draped it over the edge of the washstand near the door, and topped it with his battered Stetson. In the thick smoke and dancing light, it cast a distinctly human silhouette. He drew his Colt Peacemaker, thumbed back the hammer, and sat cross-legged behind the overturned iron bed, his back against the wall, facing the thin pine partition separating him from the hallway. Out in the corridor, Gideon Reed moved like a specter. He kept his back pressed against the wall, his Winchester raised, scanning the open doorways. The smoke was agonizing, searing his lungs, but his discipline was absolute. He ignored the pain. He passed the first room. Empty. He paused at the second room. A glance inside revealed nothing but a terrified rat scurrying under a dresser. As he approached the third room, his keen eyes caught a break in the smoke. A silhouette near the doorframe. A man leaning against a washstand, waiting to strike. Reed didn't hesitate. He swung out into the doorway, the Winchester leveled, and fired twice. Crack, crack. The heavy .44-40 slugs tore through the canvas duster and shattered the washstand behind it. Ceramic exploded in a cloud of white dust. The hat tumbled to the floor. For a fraction of a second, Reed realized his mistake. There was no blood, no body. Checkmate, a voice whispered, not from the doorway, but from through the wall to Reed's immediate right. Before Reed could pivot, the nameless man, calculating the exact trajectory of Reed's shots, fired his Colt blindly through the thin, cheap pine wall, separating the hallway from the room. The heavy .45 caliber bullet punched through the wood like paper. It caught Gideon Reed in the left side, tearing through his pristine, tailored suit jacket, grazing his ribs and exiting through his back. Reed staggered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as the impact spun him around. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the opposite wall of the hallway. Pain, hot and blinding, flared in his side, but the Pinkerton training held tight. He didn't drop his rifle. He gritted his teeth, levered a fresh round into the chamber, and unleashed a barrage of suppressing fire directly through the wall where the shot had come from. Bang, 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 bang! The thin pine partition was pulverized, turning into a sieve of splinters and daylight as the heavy rifle rounds chewed it to pieces. Inside the room, the nameless man remained perfectly still behind the overturned iron bed frame. 3 of Reed's bullets struck the thick iron with heavy ringing clangs, flattening out and dropping to the floor. The iron had saved his life. The firing stopped. The only sound was the crackle of the approaching fire and Reed's heavy, ragged breathing in the hallway. "You missed the vitals," Reed called out, his voice strained but maintaining its icy composure. Blood was seeping through his fingers as he pressed his left hand against his side. "A grazing wound. Painful, but not fatal. You, however, are out of tricks." "Am I?" the nameless man asked, standing up slowly. The smoke in the room was banking lower, leaving only a few feet of breathable air near the floor. The heat was becoming unbearable. The paint on the walls was beginning to bubble and peel. "The fire has reached the hallway," Reed stated, leaning heavily against the doorframe of the opposite room. "In 3 minutes, this entire structure will collapse. Come out with the ledger, and I swear on my honor I will put a bullet in your head quickly. Stay in there, and you will burn alive." The nameless man kicked the shattered doorframe of his room and stepped out into the smoke-filled hallway. He stood 10 feet from Reed. The two men faced each other in the burning corridor, ghosts in the ash. Reed smiled, raising his Winchester with his one good arm, resting the barrel against the doorframe to steady it. "A wise choice. Hand it over." The nameless man didn't raise his gun. He looked at Reed, his pale eyes entirely unfazed by the rifle pointed at his chest. "I don't have it," the stranger said softly. Reed's finger tightened on the trigger. "Do not lie to me. It is in your saddlebags or your coat. I will find it when you are dead." "I rode into town on a roan gelding, Reed." "Do you remember?" the stranger asked, taking a slow step forward. The flames licked at the ceiling above them, raining sparks down onto their shoulders. "Yes," Reed hissed, his patience gone. "Where is the book?" "I didn't bring the horse to the saloon," the nameless man said, an unnerving, predatory grin finally breaking across his stoic face. "I left him at the livery stable at the edge of town, with the sheriff's deputy. I paid the boy $20 to put the ledger on the 4:15 stagecoach heading to Carson City, to the federal marshal's office." Gideon Reed froze. The cold calculation in his eyes shattered. For the first time since he had ridden into Ophir's End, pure, unadulterated panic gripped the former Pinkerton detective. "You are lying," Reed breathed, but the certainty was gone from his voice. "The stagecoach left 10 minutes ago," the nameless man said, raising his heavy Colt. "You don't have time to kill me and catch it, Gideon. You have to choose, the bounty or the secret." The flames roared, the ceiling groaned, and Gideon Reed realized with horrifying clarity that the nameless man hadn't just trapped him in a burning building. He had trapped his mind in an impossible riddle. The heat inside the boarding house hallway was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a living, breathing entity. The wallpaper blistered and peeled in long, curling strips, igniting mid-air and drifting down like demonic snow. The structural beams of Amos Finch's saloon groaned under the sheer thermal stress, the heavy wood snapping with a sound like artillery fire. Gideon Reed stood paralyzed in the inferno, his Winchester rifle leveled at the chest of the nameless man. The blood leaking from the bullet graze on his rib cage felt cold compared to the blistering air. For the first time in his ruthless, calculated life, the former Pinkerton detective was staring at an equation he could not solve. The stagecoach left 10 minutes ago. If Reed stayed and pulled the trigger, he might kill the ghost standing before him. He would survive the shootout. But Arthur Pendleton didn't care about survival. He cared about the ledger. If that book reached the federal marshal in Carson City, Pendleton would hang, and before he dropped from the gallows, he would send an army of hired guns to ensure Reed died screaming. The nameless man didn't move. He stood with the heavy Colt Peacemaker hanging loosely at his side, his pale eyes reflecting the swirling orange flames. He wasn't just offering a choice, he was offering a test of Reed's fundamental nature. Was he a hunter seeking vengeance for his fallen posse, or was he a mercenary driven entirely by a paycheck? Reed's jaw tightened until the muscles threatened to snap. His eyes darted from the stranger to the collapsing ceiling and then to the smoke-filled doorway leading to the alley. The mathematics of cowardice took over. "You are a dead man," Reed spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Pendleton will send 50 men after you." "Let them come," the stranger replied evenly. "They'll find the same thing you did." Reed didn't fire. With a sharp, furious curse, he lowered the Winchester, turned his back on his prey, and sprinted toward the rear window of the saloon. He threw himself through the jagged remains of the glass just as the burning roof above the main bar caved in, sending a volcanic eruption of sparks and flaming debris into the Nevada sky. The nameless man stood alone in the hallway. He calmly holstered his Peacemaker. He didn't run. He turned his attention to the massive, unmoving form of Josiah Higgins lying on the floorboards. The fire was inches away from the unconscious tracker's buffalo coat. With a heavy sigh, the nameless man grabbed Higgins by the collar of his thick coat. Grunting against the sheer dead weight of the 300-pound brute, he dragged him backward through the smoke, pulling him out the side door of the boarding house and rolling him roughly into the muddy drainage ditch of the alley. Higgins would live, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of his miserable life, a constant reminder of the day he met the ghost. The stranger stepped out of the alley just as the entire front facade of Amos Finch's saloon collapsed into the street. The crash was deafening. Ophir's End was in absolute pandemonium. Miners and townspeople ran through the muddy street with buckets of water, desperately trying to keep the flames from spreading to the general store next door. In the center of the chaos stood Sheriff William T. Cobb, shouting useless orders and looking entirely overwhelmed. Sheriff Cobb froze as the nameless man emerged from the smoke, dusting ashes from his frayed canvas duster. The sheriff's hand hovered over his revolver, trembling violently. He looked at the stranger, then at the dead body of Elias Cole, bleeding out on the boardwalk, and finally back to the stranger. "Don't," the nameless man said gently, holding up a single placating hand. "You pull that iron, Cobb, and I'll have to put you down. And I ain't got no quarrel with the law." Cobb slowly, gratefully, moved his hand away from his holster. "What in God's name happened in there, mister?" "Pest control," the stranger said. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and let out a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the roar of the fire. A moment later, the rhythmic thud of hooves approached from the livery stable at the far end of the street. A massive, beautiful roan gelding trotted through the crowd, ignoring the flames and the shouting men, stopping squarely beside the nameless man. The stranger reached up and patted the horse's neck, calming the animal. Cobb wiped soot from his brow. "Where's Reed?" "Riding hard for the Carson City Trail," the stranger replied, swinging himself effortlessly into the saddle. He looked down at the lawman. "He's chasing a ghost of his own making." "You ain't riding out?" Cobb asked, bewildered. "He'll come back when he catches the stage." "He won't catch anything but dust, Sheriff," the nameless man said, pulling his battered Stetson low over his eyes. "And by the time he figures that out, I'll be halfway to Colorado. You tell Arthur Pendleton that if he wants his book, he can come find me himself. No more lapdogs." With a sharp click of his tongue, the stranger spurred the roan gelding. He didn't ride out in a frantic gallop. He rode out at a steady, deliberate walk, cutting a solitary figure against the backdrop of the burning town, a man who had walked into a slaughterhouse and walked out an architect of ruin. 3 miles outside of Ophir's End, the desert gave way to the jagged, merciless terrain of Dead Man's Wash. It was a narrow canyon of red rock and bleached bones, baked by the relentless afternoon sun. Gideon Reed rode like a demon out of hell. He had stolen Elias Cole's black mare from the hitching post in town, leaving his own exhausted horse behind. He whipped the mare relentlessly, his tailored suit completely ruined, stained with sweat, soot, and the dark, sticky blood seeping from the bullet wound in his side. Every jarring strike of the horse's hooves sent a blinding spike of agony through his ribs, but panic pushed the pain aside. He had to catch the stagecoach. If he failed, if that ledger reached the federal marshal, Arthur Pendleton's empire of cattle, water, and blood would crumble, and Pendleton would ensure Reed crumbled with it, piece by agonizing piece. "Come on," Reed screamed, his voice a hoarse, ragged tear in his throat, spurring the mare until her flanks frothed with white sweat. He rounded a sharp bend in the canyon and finally saw it. A massive plume of yellow dust rose into the sky about a half-mile ahead. Through the haze, he could make out the heavy wooden chassis of the Concord stagecoach, pulled by a team of 6 laboring Mustangs. Reed drew his Winchester from the scabbard, clutching the reins in his teeth. He ignored the screaming pain in his side and pushed the black mare into a dead sprint. The gap closed rapidly. The heavy stagecoach was not built for speed, especially not on the rocky incline of the Wash, As he closed within 50 yards, the driver, an old leather-skinned teamster named Caleb, spotted the lone rider approaching at a breakneck pace. Seeing the rifle in Reed's hand, Caleb panicked. He cracked his long whip over the team of horses, shouting frantically, trying to outrun the threat. "Stop!" Reed bellowed, but his voice was swallowed by the thunder of 24 hooves. Reed didn't have time for a chase. He stood in the stirrups, leveled the Winchester with his one good arm, and fired a warning shot that shattered the wooden luggage rail inches from the driver's head. Caleb shrieked, hauling back on the heavy leather brake lever with all his might. The stagecoach skidded violently, the wooden wheels locking up and grinding against the gravel, throwing up a massive cloud of dust before finally coming to a lurching, shuddering halt in the center of the canyon. Reed rode up alongside the coach, his horse dancing nervously. He kept the rifle aimed squarely at Caleb's chest. Inside the coach, two terrified passengers, a traveling salesman and a young woman, screamed and ducked beneath the velvet seats. "Throw down the lockbox," Reed ordered, gasping for breath, coughing on the thick canyon dust. "Now, old man, throw it down!" Caleb held up his hands in surrender, trembling violently. "We ain't got no payroll, mister. Swear to God, just mail and luggage." "The package!" Reed barked, his cold composure entirely shattered, replaced by the desperate frenzy of a cornered animal. "The package the deputy put on the coach in Ophir's End. Give it to me." Caleb blinked, confused. "The deputy? He didn't put no package on here. Just a leather satchel. Paid me $20 to make sure it got to the marshal's office in Carson." "Give it to me," Reed demanded, cocking the lever of the Winchester. Moving with agonizing slowness, Caleb reached under his driver's bench and pulled out a heavy, worn leather satchel. It was buckled tight. He tossed it over the side. It hit the dirt with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Drive," Reed commanded. Caleb didn't hesitate. He released the brakes, snapped the reins, and the stagecoach rattled away down the canyon, leaving Reed alone in the settling dust. Reed practically fell out of the saddle. He collapsed to his knees in the dirt, clutching his bleeding side, his breath coming in ragged, painful wheezes. His vision swam with exhaustion and blood loss. But he had done it. He had outsmarted the stranger. He had the ledger. Pendleton would pay him the $10,000, and he would disappear to San Francisco. With trembling, blood-stained fingers, Reed unbuckled the leather straps of the satchel. He threw open the flap. There was no leather-bound accounting ledger inside. Reed stared into the bag, his mind refusing to process the image before him. He blinked, wiping the sweat and soot from his eyes, thinking it was a mirage brought on by the pain. But the object remained. Inside the satchel was a heavy, rusted iron horseshoe, wrapped in a piece of torn canvas to give it weight. Tucked beneath the horseshoe was a small piece of telegraph paper. Reed reached in with a shaking hand and pulled the paper free. He unfolded it. Written in elegant, flowing cursive, the undeniable handwriting of a highly educated man, not a simple drifter, were 3 short sentences. "Gideon, a man who only calculates the odds will always fall for a bluff. The ledger never left my saddlebags. You are exactly what I saw in the saloon. A dead man." The paper slipped from Reed's fingers, fluttering gently to the desert floor. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the heavy, labored breathing of the dying black mare. Reed looked up at the empty sky, the crushing weight of his absolute failure pressing down on his chest heavier than the heat of the burning saloon. The nameless man hadn't just outdrawn Elias Cole. He hadn't just outfought Josiah Higgins. He had systematically dismantled Gideon Reed's mind. He had manufactured a panic so profound that Reed had abandoned the high ground, abandoned his pride, and ridden out into the desert on a fool's errand to chase a rusted horseshoe. Gideon Reed slumped backward into the dirt, staring back up the trail toward Ophir's End. The bleeding in his side was worsening, and he was 30 miles from a doctor, stranded in hostile territory with an exhausted horse. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the canyon walls the color of fresh blood. He closed his eyes, the stranger's gravelly voice echoing in the empty chambers of his mind. "I don't see 3 gunslingers. I see 3 dead men." The ghost had been right all along. Carson City was a far cry from the dying, dust-choked streets of Ophir's End. It was a city built on silver and the ruthless ambition of men who wore bespoke suits instead of canvas dusters. In the heart of the city stood the grand 3-story brick headquarters of the Pendleton Cattle and Freight Company. The building projected power, untouchable wealth, and absolute security. Arthur Pendleton sat behind a massive desk carved from solid mahogany, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He was a barrel-chested man with a thick silver mustache and eyes that had long ago forgotten how to show mercy. The brass carriage clock on his mantel ticked steadily toward midnight. He was waiting for a telegram from Western Union. Gideon Reed was an exceptionally punctual man, and the silence from the telegraph office was beginning to gnaw at the edges of Pendleton's ironclad confidence. The heavy oak door to his private office swung open. Pendleton didn't look up from the map spread across his desk. "I told you, Collins, do not disturb me unless it is the wire from Ophir's End." "Collins is taking a nap in the hallway," a low, gravelly voice replied, "along with the 2 Pinkerton men you hired to watch the back stairs." Pendleton's head snapped up. Standing inside his locked, fortified office, dripping rainwater onto the expensive Persian rug, was a man in a frayed canvas duster. A battered Stetson obscured the top half of his face, but the pale, dead eyes staring out from the shadows were unmistakable. He carried the smell of ozone, wet wool, and black powder into the pristine room. Pendleton slowly lowered his crystal glass. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "You." "Me," the nameless man said. He took 3 slow steps into the room, his spurs chiming softly against the hardwood floor beneath the rug. He reached into his coat. Pendleton instinctively tensed, his right hand sliding toward the top drawer of his desk, where he kept a silver-plated Remington Derringer. But the stranger didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound accounting ledger and tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy final thud right on top of Pendleton's map of the Nevada Territory. "I believe you lost this," the nameless man said casually. Pendleton stared at the book, a bead of cold sweat trickling down his neck. "Where are Reed, Cole, and Higgins?" "Cole is dead," the stranger answered flatly. "Higgins is crippled, and Gideon Reed is currently bleeding out somewhere in Dead Man's Wash, chasing a horseshoe he thought was this ledger. Your hounds are gone, Pendleton." Pendleton swallowed hard. He looked at the ledger, then back at the drifter. The arithmetic of survival, much like Reed's, began to turn in his head. This was a man who had single-handedly dismantled the 3 deadliest killers in the West. But every man had a price. $10,000, Pendleton said, his voice slick and persuasive. "That was the bounty on your head. I'll give you $50,000, right now. I have a safe in the wall behind that painting, cash and gold certificates. You leave the ledger, you walk out that door, and you can buy your own town in California." The nameless man stepped closer to the desk. He didn't look at the painting. He didn't look at the ledger. He looked dead into Pendleton's eyes. 50,000, the stranger repeated softly. "Is that what 32 lives are worth? The families at Black Rock? You paid Judge Emmett Tolliver $2,000 to forge the deeds, and you paid your riders $500 to burn the homesteads to the ground, with the women and children still inside." "That is business!" Pendleton snapped, his temper flaring through his fear. "This is the frontier. Progress requires blood. If you are not here to blackmail me, Drifter, then what do you want?" The nameless man reached into his duster one final time. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled back the heavy canvas flap to reveal a gleaming silver star pinned to his vest. It was a badge, not a tin star of a local town sheriff, but the heavy, authoritative crest of a United States Deputy Federal Marshal. Pendleton's face drained of all color. He looked like a corpse. "Your federal law," Pendleton whispered, the reality crashing down on him. Pfft. Under the direct authority of Governor Lewis R. Bradley and the Attorney General, the marshal said, his voice dropping its rustic drawl, replacing it with the sharp, educated articulation of a seasoned investigator. I wasn't running from your men, Arthur. I was drawing them out. I needed to isolate Reed, Cole, and Higgins so they couldn't protect you when the time came. You can't prove anything, Pendleton stammered, his hand inching closer to the desk drawer. That ledger. It's a forgery. It's circumstantial. It might be, the marshal agreed, but the original ledger I handed to the federal judge an hour ago is quite compelling. The one on your desk is just a blank diary I picked up in Ophir's End. I just wanted to see the look on your face when you realized your empire was built on a house of cards. Pendleton roared, throwing open the desk drawer and snatching the silver derringer. He never even cocked the hammer. The marshal's hand moved with blinding supernatural speed. The heavy Colt Peacemaker cleared leather and fired in a single heartbeat. The bullet shattered Pendleton's right wrist, sending the derringer spinning uselessly across the room. Pendleton collapsed back into his leather chair, screaming, clutching his ruined, bloody hand against his chest. I don't see a cattle baron, the marshal whispered, holstering his smoking gun and turning his back on the crying man. I see a dead man walking. Outside the window, the heavy boots of 20 federal marshals echoed on the cobblestones as they surrounded the building. The hunt was finally over. And that is the brutal, true-to-life saga of how a single nameless federal marshal dismantled a corrupt cattle empire and the 3 deadliest bounty hunters of the 1870s. By using their own greed and paranoia against them, he proved that the fastest gun in the West means nothing if the mind pulling the trigger is clouded by fear. Did you see that final twist coming? Let me know down in the comments. If you think Gideon Reed managed to survive the desert, or if Dead Man's Wash claimed another soul, if you loved this gritty dive into Wild West drama, hit that like button, share it with your fellow history buffs, and absolutely subscribe to the channel for more legendary tales from the frontier.